Good afternoon, everybody. This is Todd and Megan with the Weather Service. Megan, our local climate expert, has a lot of great information for you today concerning the upcoming winter season. Now, if you do have any questions during the talk, please type them in the question box and we'll get to them after Megan's presentations. And with that, Megan, I'll take it away.
All right, thanks, Todd. And thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. I know there's been a lot going on across the state, especially with the fires ongoing. So I appreciate you taking an hour out of your afternoon to come chat with us, and we'll fill you in on what to expect this upcoming winter, what we're thinking for Western and Central North Dakota. Before we get too far into the winter outlooks, I did want to take just a minute to talk about kind of the short-term outlook, since again, I know fire weather has been a concern lately, so I wanted to touch upon a few things there. This is the 8 to 14-day temperature and precipitation outlook from the Climate Prediction Center. You can see there is still some favoring of above normal temperatures through the end of October. There's a little bit of a signal for above average precipitation, but at this point, we're not seeing anything too concrete on that front. So unfortunately, it doesn't seem like we're going to get too much relief from the pattern we're in right now. Looking a little bit further ahead, these are the newly released November outlooks for temperature and precipitation. You can see on the temperature outlook on the left that eastern North Dakota is slightly favored for above normal temperatures, but there's pretty equal chances for the rest of the state. Personally, I would not be surprised if we see the above normal temperatures continue through most of the month, and I'll get into why as we go through the presentation. And also with the precipitation outlook, there's no strong signal either way. That's what the equal chances means. So in a sense, it's good that we're not seeing a significant dry signal for the month of November, but we're also not seeing any strong signal for above normal precipitation. So unfortunately, on the fire weather front, not seeing any significant pattern changes coming up in the next couple of weeks. I also wanted to touch on, this is the average high temperatures for Bismarck. It is worth noting that average highs decrease quickly through the fall season. So even though we are saying above normal, it doesn't necessarily mean highs in the 70s or even the 60s, especially later on in the season. The average high temperature in Bismarck today is 57 degrees. By the end of the month, that's down to 48 degrees. And by the end of November, meteorological fall, it's down to 34 degrees. So again, just because it's above normal does not mean that it's going to be really warm, especially as we get later in the fall. The average monthly precipitation also drops off pretty significantly. It's 1 43/100 inches in October, and it goes down to 69/100 in November. So again, we're not expecting too much precipitation this time of year, especially as we get into November. Now for the more official Climate Prediction Center winter outlook. Obviously, this gets a lot of press because a lot of parts of the country view December, January, February, meteorological winter, as the whole winter season. We know up here in North Dakota, winter is not just 3 months, so we're going to be stepping through a couple additional seasonal outlooks. We'll be showing the Climate Prediction Center temperature outlooks on the left and precipitation outlooks on the right. These are for 3 months, and you can see the key down at the bottom. It's a probability forecast, so the percent chance of above normal, near normal, or below normal, or if there's just white shading, that means that there are equal chances. So looking at the temperature outlook for December, January, February on the left, you can see that there is blue shading across all of North Dakota. This is the 40 to 50% contour for leaning below. Those are actually pretty good odds for an entire season. It can be kind of hard to categorize one season as either above or below normal. There's always going to be variations during the season, but 40 to 50% for an entire season is a decent probability. You can see on the right, the precipitation outlook. White shading across all of North Dakota means that there are equal chances for above, below, or near normal precipitation. We'll talk a little bit later on about how we do and don't agree with that here locally, but you can see that there are some areas for above normal precipitation favored across the Pacific Northwest as well as the Great Lakes region. The Climate Prediction Center does have these really handy pie charts on their website available with all of these outlooks. It's just a nice reminder that although we are favored for below normal temperatures, it's about 46% in the Bismarck area, there are still odds for near normal, 33%, and even above normal. Again, it can be really hard to be super sure of any one outcome when we're talking about an entire season. So although we are favored for cold, it's never a guarantee. Climate outlooks are pretty tricky in that way, but this is still a decent signal for the winter season. The next 3-month period is January, February, March. Again, temperature on the left, precipitation on the right. You can see that cold signal is still there, maybe a little bit less across eastern North Dakota, but western central North Dakota still firmly in that 40 to 50% chance of below normal temperatures for that 3-month period. And again, precipitation, equal chances for North Dakota, although we are in the middle of 2 areas of above normal precipitation favored. Going a little bit further, February, March, April, same thing. Maybe a little bit decreasing now into parts of central North Dakota, but otherwise most of our forecast area is in the 40 to 50% chance of below normal temperatures. So continuing through the winter and into the spring season. And again, equal chances for precipitation, starting to lose that signal for above normal on either side of us. And finally, the spring season, which we'll actually talk a little bit more about the spring season at the very end. We finally start to see that cold signal decreasing a little bit, although it is still present across western parts of central North Dakota. That's in that 33 to 40%. So just leaning below, so certainly not as strong of a signal as we go into the actual meteorological spring season. And again, no strong signal in these outlooks for precipitation. When we talk about the climate outlooks, one of the main things that forecasters are looking at is something called the El Nino Southern Oscillation. Obviously, looking 3 to 6 months out can be pretty difficult, and we don't have too many tools to rely on. We do have some, model guidance, ensemble guidance, but overall, one of the main things we are looking at is the El Nino Southern Oscillation because of its predictability and its scale. If you haven't heard of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, it's a climate pattern based on sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean, where there's an interaction between the ocean and the atmosphere, and it ends up influencing the pattern of the entire globe. I do get that question a lot of why we're looking at the Pacific Ocean when we live in North Dakota and we are pretty far from any ocean. But it's one of the interesting parts about weather and about climate is that everything is working together in some way. So you can see the schematic over here on the right of how that interaction works. There are 2 phases to this oscillation. The warm phase is called El Nino, and the cold phase is called La Nina. Right now, we do have a La Nina watch in effect. It's a little bit different than the past couple of seasons where we actually don't have any observed conditions just yet. Last year, we were in an El Nino by this point where we had El Nino conditions ongoing. Right now, we are still in that watch phase. Everything's progressing a little bit slower than expected. But we are still favored for La Nina conditions. They are expected to emerge with about a 75% chance. The caveat is that it is likely to be a short and a weak event. So that certainly has some influence on our confidence and overall what we're expecting for the upcoming winter in North Dakota. Typically, for La Nina, we see colder than average temperatures favored across the state. You do get a more variable polar jet stream. You have a blocking high pressure in the North Pacific. The jet stream goes up over that into Alaska, into Canada, and then it comes back down into the continental United States. Makes it much easier for that colder air from the higher latitudes to come down into the north central US. It has been a little bit more inconsistent since about 1990. So again, this is typically what we see, but it's never a guarantee, especially in climate world. The other thing is that the weaker the event, the lower the probability that we see this expected pattern. If you're thinking about the strength of an event, sometimes it seems like, oh, it's a strong La Nina, so we're going to see stronger anomalies, but it's actually just the probability that we see the expected pattern. So it's less likely that we see this pattern, but we could still see those very strong anomalies that that are associated with the La Nina pattern. We're also expecting a transition back to ENSO neutral by the spring, so that is another thing to consider. So then the next question is, what is ENSO neutral? It's where the El Nino Southern Oscillation is neither in a warm phase or the cold phase. It's just kind of in the middle. The ENSO neutral range is anywhere from minus 0.5 degrees Celsius to plus 0.5 degrees Celsius. So anything in there technically counts as ENSO neutral. If the sea surface temperature anomalies get colder than that, it's La Nina. If they're warmer than that 0.5, it's El Nino. So one of the other things we are considering is that even if we are not technically in La Nina conditions, we're still on the cold side of that ENSO neutral range. That can have impacts as well, especially because the atmospheric setup of an ENSO neutral is similar to that of La Nina, it's just weaker, whereas an El Nino is an actual reversal of that atmospheric setup. So again, even a cool ENSO neutral phase can actually look somewhat similar to a La Nina, although again, we do have less confidence in the expected impacts, and then we become dependent on other shorter term climate features. But if you look at this graph on the left, this is the official ENSO probabilities. The blue bars are the probabilities of a La Nina, and then the gray bars are the probability of ENSO neutral. You can see that the La Nina bar is highest, around 75% in that November, December, January season. Then those probabilities start to decrease relatively quickly as we go late winter into the spring. And by meteorological spring, March, April, May, the ENSO neutral probabilities are the most dominant ones. So again, we are expecting this to be a weak and short-lived La Nina event. So again, typically what we see during a La Nina, on the left are the October and November temperature anomalies for all La Ninas. On the right are the temperature anomalies for all La Ninas during that meteorological winter season. So again, two very different stories. And this is why we are not surprised by the mild fall that we've been having. And I would expect it to continue through at least a good chunk of November, because these temperature anomalies for October and November, you can see very consistently positive across the entire really central US, especially that northern plains and the Minnesota region, all favored for warm. This is the influence of La Nina, but it also is aided by the fact that our falls are warming. So those are working together to give us more confidence in the mild temperatures this fall. Then we look to December, January, February anomalies on the right, and that is pretty consistently cold across the entire region, with the strongest anomalies across the international border. So again, we do typically see a rather sudden switch from the warm October, November temperature anomalies to the more winter-like temperatures in December, January, February that then linger on into the spring season. These are the same plots, but just for weak La Nina years instead of all La Nina years, just to show that although, again, less confidence, less likelihood of seeing the expected pattern, but we do still typically see that pattern. The cold anomalies on the right may be a little bit weaker, but overall still the warm October and November before a transition to colder than normal temperatures for meteorological winter. The next question then, of course, that we always get is, if it's going to be cold, does that mean it's going to be snowy? And although it's a little hard sometimes during ENSO events, there's not the strongest correlation. We have much more confidence in temperature influences than we do in precipitation, but I did think these were interesting. On the left is the average snowfall pattern for all La Nina years. You can see that in North Dakota, there is some just white shading, which means that there's really not a strong difference from the average seasonal snowfall. And that signal becomes a lot more consistent when you look at the right-hand image, where that's the average snowfall pattern for weak La Nina years. So that's what we're expecting right now. You can see that the positive snowfall anomaly is much more consistent across North Dakota and the entire Northern Plains region. Most of the area is in that 4 to 12 inches above average. So again, there is some evidence that although looking at those Climate Prediction Center outlooks, there's not, we're just in equal chances for all of the cold season months, that there is some evidence that with a weak La Nina, we are favored for above normal snowfall. These also only go up to 2009, so they don't include all the most recent data, but there is that signal. So I thought these were interesting to show. Now to go a little bit deeper into some data, these are all the weak La Nina years since 1950. There are 11 of them. All this data is for Bismarck. It is a little bit easier to highlight Bismarck just because we have a really good snow record. So that's why we're focused on Bismarck and not one of our other cities. For the years, anything with a little star right next to it are seasons right after an El Nino winter, which is what we're coming out of. And then if there's the caret next to it, that means that there is a transition to ENSO neutral late in the season. So theoretically, if you're looking at these 11 seasons, there's two that kind of stand out as being in a similar setup as to what we are right now. 1964 to 1965 and 1983 to 1984, both were coming out of an El Nino winter and then transitioning to ENSO neutral late in the season. So a rather weak and short-lived La Nina. But again, it's really hard to compare. Having only two comparison seasons doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of the significance that you can get from that. But we'll step through this table. So I know there's been a lot of interest in when we're going to get that first snow, especially again, as there's been so many fire weather concerns. From the last 50 years or so, the chance for measurable snow before November 1st is very low for Bismarck and really all of southern North Dakota. Our average is October 28th, so not too much later, but I honestly, with the way things have been going, I would not be surprised if we weren't really seeing that first measurable snow across the south until maybe the second week of November. I think we still have some time before we get to that time of year. Maybe a little bit earlier up in the northern part of the state, but otherwise it's a pretty significant signal that if it's before November 1st, the chance of Bismarck and that area getting any measurable snow is very low. Looking at snowfall for December, January, February, it skews near normal or below normal. There are some outlier years, and that's why it can be really hard. And we'll talk a little bit later about the differences between December, January, February, and looking at the entire season. Again, it can be kind of tough to differentiate because most of the weather world thinks of meteorological winter as just DJF, whereas our winter is 5 to 6 months. But for just December, January, February snowfall, maybe normal, a little bit below normal, but not a super strong trend either way. The trend gets a little bit more interesting when you start looking at seasonal snowfall totals. So again, we can get snow starting, really in October going all the way through April. So not just December, January, February. It's pretty varied. You can see that 2 of the 3 most recent weak La Nina years do have snow of over 100 inches, including the winter of 2022, 2023. I'm sure you all remember that, getting very close to that all-time record. So again, it's really all over the place, but what I thought was interesting was if you're looking at all of these, the majority of these years have seasonal snowfall totals of at least 44 inches, which really is not that far from normal. The normal from Bismarck is 50.5 inches. So overall, again, there's not a lot of evidence to make us think it's going to be well below normal. And there are some extreme outliers in there. Again, there's the 100.3, 101.2, there's an 80.1. But overall, really not a lot of evidence to make us go much lower than normal, if at all. So that is some good news for, especially thinking of the drought conditions and wanting a snowpack and things like that. Where we have the most confidence, like I said, is with the temperatures. You can see that of these 11 years, 1 was warmer than normal, 3 were about average, and then the rest were cold. So it's not out of the question that our winter temperatures end up near average, especially again, it can be hard thinking about an entire 3-month period because temperatures are going to be pretty variable, especially up here in North Dakota. But the chance that they are warmer than normal is very unlikely. So I know we're getting a little stats heavy, which we typically don't get so technical, but I thought this was really interesting, especially again, thinking about the springtime. So these box and whisker plots show the precipitation distribution during ENSO events. They are technically valid for the western half of North Dakota, but these do look very similar for the eastern half of North Dakota. On the right is the precipitation distribution for December, January, February. You can see the box and whisker plots. One is for El Nino, the middle is neutral, and then the right is La Nina. You can see on the left-hand graphic for December, January, February, that 50th percentile, kind of the median, is really similar for the 3 of them. So there's not a lot of difference in winter precipitation between the ENSO phases, which is why it can be really tough for us to give a good outlook, because a lot of the times there's not anything skewing us one way or the other. And we're so dependent on ENSO phases at this time period that if there's not a strong signal there, it's kind of tough to find a strong signal. What I thought was interesting is looking on the right, this is the March, April, May precipitation distribution for the Western North Dakota Climate Division. You can see again, it starts with El Nino on the left, ENSO neutral in the middle, and La Nina on the right. And although there is a lot of spread in the neutral and the La Nina whiskers, there's certainly a notable increase in March, April, May precipitation for both ENSO neutral and La Nina compared to El Nino. So that is hopefully some good news that it certainly is favored for a little bit more precipitation right now, even if we're in an ENSO neutral by the spring. That's still a little bit better than if we were in an El Nino. So this is also a reason to favor a little bit more active, especially later on in the winter season into the spring. And that could certainly influence our seasonal snowfall, especially if we hang on to those cold temperatures a little bit longer. There are a lot of other things that can play a factor, plenty of other oscillations that you've maybe heard of, the Madden-Julian oscillation, Arctic oscillation, North American oscillation, southern stratospheric warming. All these things have a lot shorter predictability and a lot less skill on really long time periods, which is why they're not used in seasonal outlooks. These are things that we're going to be paying attention to for the weeks 2, 3, and 4. And if we see something, we will certainly let you know. I think especially if we end up not transitioning to a La Nina and we end up just an ENSO neutral, these are going to be what we're dependent on. So as soon as we get confidence in something, and if we see a signal in kind of that weeks 2 through 4 period, we will be sure to let you know, because we might end up very dependent on these climate features. The other one that's important is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. There's been local research done here at the office that shows that the historically bad winters and springs are when there is both a La Nina and a negative PDO. Not every La Nina and negative PDO are going to bring a bad winter and a bad spring, but the majority of the bad winters and spring seasons are during a La Nina and a negative PDO. And yes, we are in a negative PDO right now. We were also in a negative PDO for that winter of 2022, 2023. So again, it's not a guarantee, especially with wintertime precip, especially with spring flooding. I know that starts to become a concern pretty quickly, but that is, again, something that we are keeping an eye on and we'll be watching through the rest of the winter. I wanted to talk quickly about how different La Nina seasons can be. So last winter, we had an El Nino, but the 3 winters before that were back-to-back-to-back La Nina winters, and they all looked very different. So these maps are the average temperature departure from mean. On the far left is the winter of 2020 to 2021. The middle is 2021 to 2022, and the right is 2022 to 2023. So you can see right away that first winter where we were expecting La Nina conditions and it looked nothing like a La Nina. We were well above normal for our temperatures, and that was not at all what we were expecting. And that the second La Nina of that 3, that's the middle plot, you can see it was definitely colder, especially as you get into northern and eastern North Dakota, closer to average in the southwest part of the state, but overall a little bit more what we were expecting. And then by the time we got to the 3rd La Nina, which was the weak La Nina compared to the other 2, that was where we got the significant cold. That was really exactly what we were expecting in terms of temperatures. So again, all 3 of these, all La Ninas, but all looked very different in terms of the temperature anomaly that we ended up with for the entire cold season. Then looking at snowfall departures, this is the accumulated snowfall departure from mean, again, for the first winter on the left, the second winter in the middle, and then the 3rd on the right. So the first one, obviously, we had those warmer than normal temperatures and our snowfall anomalies were very low. That was when we ended up going into a very significant drought in the summer of 2021. So although it's technically within the range of possibilities, I really don't see that happening again, but that did happen in 2020 to 2021. The next winter, luckily, we got much more snow, especially across the northern parts of the state, had pretty good snow positive anomalies, so that was some relief there. And then finally, the 3rd of those triple dip La Nina winters was the winter of 2022 to 2023, where Bismarck was, I think, 4/10 off of our all-time record. I'm sure a lot of you remember that. I certainly do. So again, 3 very different winters in terms of temperature, in terms of snowfall, and that is why this does get so tricky, where we have an expectation going in, but there's so many factors that can play a role throughout the entire winter season that it's hard to get too specific on what we're expecting. But to kind of summarize what we think we're expecting, for temperatures near to above normal temperatures through the rest of fall, before at some point, second half of November into December, we are expecting to transition to more winter-like temperatures. And then really I'm expecting those to persist through the winter, really through March and into April. Obviously, we'll moderate at some points. I'm not saying that we won't ever get mild. I think even last winter we were above normal, but we also ended up with an incredibly strong cold outbreak where we had wind chills of 70 below in Dickinson. So it's certainly, that's why it's so hard to categorize one season as, if we say cold, it doesn't mean it's not going to get warm, but overall favored for cold into that spring season. For precipitation, again, not expecting that first measurable snow until sometime in November, especially across southern North Dakota. There is a stronger signal for near to above normal precipitation the second half of the season. Stats do suggest we often get a December storm when we're in this pattern. So we could certainly get a December snowstorm, things quiet down for a little bit as we settle more into the cold, and then really start to get more active kind of in that late winter, early spring timeframe. Based on our previous winter seasons and the forecast pattern, we are expecting above normal snowfall. I wouldn't say a lot above. Again, our average for Bismarck is 50.5 inches. But right now, best guess for Bismarck would be 55 to 65 inches, slightly higher amounts to the north. Again, just to remind you all, we kind of talked about this already. Every La Nina is different. If we transition back to ENSO neutral conditions, that has an influence. If we never get cold enough for La Nina conditions, that certainly has an influence. That can make it really tough. And again, we also swing from one extreme to the other. So we talk about normals and averages, but the reality is in North Dakota, we're typically not sitting right around that normal value. We're normally one extreme to the next, so that can make it pretty difficult to categorize an entire season, and everybody's perspective of that will be different as well. We don't really know if there's going to be frequent low impact events versus high impact events. That can impact how the season goes as well. We do have a local machine learning model that we are running. Our science and operations officer, Chauncey Schultz, built this. So if you have any specific questions, you should direct them to him, because I don't know really anything about coding. But this uses AI to train a random forest model to predict the season based on factors including ENSO and PDO, which is what we talked about in this presentation. We did think it was interesting that the seasonal snowfall, the chance of being above normal for the seasonal snowfall is 72% from this model output. Again, not a guarantee, but that's a pretty decent trend that I think we're very curious to see how that ends up. The chance of above normal snowfall in December, January, February is 67%, which is interesting since that's where it was a little bit weaker, not as strong of a trend looking at historical data. Also interesting is that not really what you would expect for December, January, February temperatures. This model was actually slightly skewing towards warmer than normal when we were expecting below normal. So again, very curious to see how that ends up. As we get into the spring, the model scale does decrease a little bit, but it is strongly favoring above normal snowfall and below normal temperatures for the spring season. So again, maybe honing in on a little bit more active for the back half of winter. So we'll have to see how that turns out. Finally, for some bonus content, I know there's been a lot of talks about fire weather and about drought, and I know there's some concern for the spring already, so I wanted to add in just a little bit more data to kind of briefly address that. And again, I think the plan is to do another midwinter update sometime in January to talk about the rest of the winter, and hopefully we'll have a better idea of the spring season and what to expect. But this is the latest drought monitor that was updated this morning. Again, we have an expanding area of that D3 extreme drought across parts of western North Dakota. Really all of the drought conditions have been expanding across the western part of the state into the south central, because we just cannot seem to get much rain lately. So I know that's been a struggle, and I know there's been a lot of fires. We've been dealing with that all day today. So obviously any precipitation is going to help with drought conditions. We're really going to be dependent on having a normal to above normal snowpack in the late winter and spring, trying to get that runoff and replenishing some of the soil moisture, because it is very, very dry out there. So I wanted to look at, again, going back to those weak La Nina years, those 11 seasons, but adding in the March, April, May precipitation and the temperatures for you to look at. And it's not quite as concrete as I was hoping when I was pulling up this data. Certainly some variety, especially recently. I thought it was interesting, skewing a little bit drier since 1995, 1996 season. But again, nothing too terribly dry in a sense, but some a little bit drier than normal, a couple that have been much wetter than normal. Also typically seeing average to a little bit colder than normal, especially these past 3 spring seasons for those 3 weak La Nina events, cold, average, and cold. We do know that the spring season is cooling a little bit, so I'm inclined to lean a little bit more on those more recent seasons compared to the ones previously, since we're seeing that decent temperature trend in the spring season. So again, it's not a whole lot to hang your hat on at this point, although expecting those cooler temperatures to linger into at least part of the spring season, but hopefully we can get a little bit more active, especially with the La Nina or the ENSO neutral conditions favoring a more active pattern into the spring. So with that is my email at the bottom. If you ever have any climate questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. I love getting to talk climate, and hopefully I can be of some assistance. But I will turn it over to Todd to see if we have any questions.
All right, thank you, Megan. I guess the one thing that I want to know, because there's a lot of great information there. Are you gonna send this out to everybody?
Yes, yes, this is being recorded. So I will work on getting this uploaded to our YouTube channel so I can send that out, and I'll also send out a PDF of the slides. That's to everybody that registered, not just the people on this call. And please feel free to share that with anybody. I'm certainly able to do that. But yes, that way you can go back, you can look at the maps and the graphics. I know there was a lot of stuff to digest, so you can certainly access that later.
Okay, absolutely. Great, great. We do have a question here, and I might need some help with this. But I think, so the question is, what's the variance in temperatures and precipitation from the 30-year average when the CPC says equal chances? So what's the variation? And then for the, the equal chances, does that mean anything goes, or is it mildly above or below average? And of course, will this presentation be posted?
I'm glad everybody wants this information afterwards. That is a great question. My understanding from the Climate Prediction Center is that they're sorting everything into terciles. So basically 3 equal parts, where there's the near normal part, there's the above normal part, and the below normal part. It can be really hard to determine how much that is. I think it can really depend on the season and the variable that you're looking at. What is the still considered normal? Does equal chances mean anything goes? I think equal chances to me really just means that there's not a strong signal to tilt us either way. I know sometimes it can be interpreted as near normal, but I think that's not really what they are intending. They're just trying to signal that there's nothing in their dynamical and statistical model guidance to point them one way or the other. And they do a lot of verification on their outlooks. It's always really interesting to see, especially after the winter season, how they verified, how well they did, where there were some weaknesses. I did think it was interesting that before this official winter outlook, they actually did have us in above normal precipitation favored, and they actually took that out with this recent update that came out this morning. They said that there was a little bit lower statistical significance or confidence. So I thought that was interesting. So they're always looking at that. But yes, I think they do sort it into terciles. And so it's not just kind of a random assigning of what's close enough to normal to count. But they're very stats heavy and a lot of verification of how they're actually determining what counted as near normal, what counts as above, what counts as below. So hopefully that helps. It does get a little complicated. A lot of it does go over my head since they're certainly the climate experts there. I just do what I can locally.
No, that's great. When I see equal chances too, I think, oh, well, that's going to be about normal or whatever. So equal chances, we could have 80 inches or 50 inches, which is our normal, or 25 inches, and it would verify. I mean, any one of those would verify because they don't could be either one.
Yeah, that is where it gets really hard. And I know that as we kind of, go through the years and all of the statistical and dynamic model guidance gets better, as our computing power gets better, those are starting to improve. But you can tell it's pretty hard to talk about a whole, 3 to 6 months in the future and have a decent idea of what's going to happen.
Okay, so my guess for snowfall for the year is 36 inches. So if we're in February, 28th of February, and we're sitting at like 35.5 inches, I've got it in the bag, right?
No, not necessarily. So yeah, that's where we try to differentiate between meteorological winter, which is December, January, February, and the actual seasonal snowfall. Because again, up here in North Dakota, winter is unfortunately a lot longer than 3 months. So it gets a little tricky, especially when it comes to verification, and there's so much emphasis put on just the plain winter outlook because it's the winter outlook. But that's why we really try to look at the additional seasons on either side of that to kind of give a little bit more context. Because it's midway through October. There have been plenty of years where we've seen snow already, and that does count towards our seasonal total.
Yeah. I just wanted to point out to everybody during this winter season, or any time, of course, but please give us a call with any of your snowfall reports, impacts during this winter season. Even if you don't think, I don't know if they'll want to know this or not, we use all the information we can get. So snowfall reports, impacts near counties, give us a call and let us know.
Yes, that's a great point. Because I think a lot of people think that, especially the public, thinks that we know what's going on in every county, and I wish we did, but a lot of times we don't. We're very dependent on our reports coming in.
Okay, we have another question here, Megan. Are we concerned with a thawing, freezing pattern?
That's a great question. Probably not. I have, seen, at least from my experience, that typically when we sink into those winter temperatures in the La Nina pattern, we're pretty much stuck there. We might thaw out briefly, but it's nothing too extreme where I'd be really concerned with consistently thawing and refreezing and thawing and refreezing. Maybe some mild patterns, but I would not be too concerned just with what we've seen, especially for the past couple La Nina events, where once we get cold, I think of 2022, 2023, where Halloween was really nice and it was great. And then we got, 18 inches of snow on Veterans Day, and then we were kind of stuck for the rest of the winter. I'm not saying that's for sure going to happen, but that is what is favored when we go into the La Nina winters.
Okay, thank you, Megan. I remember, it's been quite some time ago, not necessarily thawing, but unfortunately with the fire weather, I remember in January several years ago, we had some fire weather issues. Would that be a concern this year?
Hopefully not. I know everybody's very tired of fire weather. I know here at the office, it's not our favorite thing to deal with. I think you can never really rule anything out when it comes to North Dakota and the weather. Hopefully not. I'm hoping that if we, get our normal December snowstorm that we typically see, that we'll have enough of a snowpack to kind of, keep that at bay. Some of the longer term trends, it is interesting where the winter season as a whole isn't really changing too much, but there is a little bit of a warming signal in January, and then a strong cooling signal in February. So January is kind of the wild card. I feel like this might just be my perspective, but it feels like it's kind of quiet a lot of the times. We don't get too much snow, and the temperatures can kind of be all over the place. I mean, that was when we had that cold snap last winter. And that's where we're so dependent on things like sudden stratospheric warming events and the Arctic oscillation and whatever those are doing can play a really big role in what we're seeing. And that's why as soon as we see something and we have confidence, we'll be sure to tell everyone. But unfortunately, there's a lot of things that midway through October we can't see just quite yet.
Great information, Megan. And sometime in January, probably planning something mid-season?
Yeah, that was what we did last year. And it sounded like it was really helpful. I think especially for that one, we'll be calling on our service hydrologist, Alan Schlag, since he's going to be our spring flood potential expert, because I know that certainly becomes a topic of interest by the time we get to the new year. So yeah, that is the plan for right now. And of course, if anybody ever has any questions in the interim, please, again, reach out. I would be happy to chat with you and hopefully get you whatever information you need.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah, thank you. It doesn't look like we have any more questions, so I think we'll wrap this up. Like I said, this is recording, so we will post this and get it emailed out to everyone who registered, as well as with a PDF of the slide deck, so you can reference all this later. Thank you again for joining us. I know it's been really busy, so I appreciate you taking time out of your afternoon to sit and chat with us about the upcoming winter.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan.
All right. Thanks, everyone.